Do any of you think that nationwide or universal injunctions are not being abused? I've read your stuff and I've read your writings, and I don't want to get bogged down with this, but I have little respect for your opinion because I've read your stuff. Do you think nationwide injunctions are being abused?
Certainly, Senator. I think that is.
They're being abused by both sides, aren't they? You said there are some members of the Supreme Court that are evil.
I'm very skeptical. If it's a transcription, it was probably a transcription error. I do not think I said.
No, you said it. Why don't you own up to it? Which you call some of the members of the Supreme Court evil.
I've been very critical
You're
of some
embarrassed
members of the
that
Supreme
you made
Court.
that statement, aren't you? April 22nd, 2024.
Okay, well,
big as Dallas. And you're here advising us to be respectful to federal judges? Gag me with a spoon.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to America First, the channel that puts our great nation above all else. Before we dive into today's explosive content, make sure you smash that like button and hit subscribe if you haven't already. We're growing this Patriot family every single day, and we need your support to keep bringing you the truth that the mainstream media won't tell you. Also, if you want to help us keep fighting the good fight, head over to patreon.com/AmericaFirst and support us for as low as $5 a month. Today, we're breaking down a Senate hearing that perfectly illustrates everything that's wrong with our judicial system and the liberal academic establishment. What you're about to see is Senator John Kennedy, one of the few senators with the backbone to ask the tough questions, absolutely dismantling the hypocrisy of liberal law professors who think they can play politics with our constitutional system. This hearing focused on nationwide injunctions, which for those who might not be familiar, are court orders that a single federal judge can issue that affect the entire country. Think about that for a moment. One judge, sitting in one courthouse, can override the will of the American people and stop a president from implementing policies that voters elected him to carry out. This is exactly the kind of judicial overreach that has been plaguing our republic for decades.
Would any of you advise a client to defy a federal court order?
No.
None of you would? How about you, Professor?
I mean, under most circumstances, we follow the government and private parties follow court orders. I suppose it's not, I would not rule out ever the possibility that in a sufficiently egregious order, there should be some consideration of whether there's a way.
So in some cases,
I think it's a qualified answer,
in
yes.
some cases you would.
In an extremely narrow band of cases, I think it would be considered, yes.
Okay. Do any of you think that nationwide or universal injunctions are not being abused?
I'm not sure what if I may, Senator, I'm not sure what the time horizon of the question is. I don't think that there could be good faith disagreements about the correctness of some of them, but I have not seen in the last 4 months
Professor, you're
abuse.
smart,
No.
I've read your stuff and I've read your writings, and I don't want to get bogged down with this, but I have little respect for your opinion because I've read your stuff. When someone is in the White House that you agree with and someone gets a universal injunction against him, you don't like universal injunctions. You called them judges acting like they're politicians in robes and judges looking like crass political actors. But now that President Trump's in the White House, who you dislike, you think that universal injunctions taste like pumpkin pie. So I have to discount what you say because I think you act on your political beliefs. And I worry that that's what you're teaching your kids. So I'll leave you out of that. Do you think nationwide injunctions are being abused?
Certainly, Senator. I think that is.
They're being abused by both sides, aren't they?
Yes, Senator.
Both Republicans and Democrats are forum shopping, aren't they?
Certainly.
Professor, do you disagree with that?
I think both sides are abusing them. I agree.
Okay. Both sides. There are no clean hands here. Now, your suggestion is that when a federal judge issues a nationwide injunction, there should be an automatic stay and an expedited right of appeal. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
Do you disagree with that?
I haven't given enough thought to have a position on it, Senator.
I suspect, Professor, your answer will be it depends on who's president.
No, Senator.
Let me ask you about this. What if we had a rule? I was reading an article the other day. I'm not suggesting it. I just want your opinions. That said, if a president, any president, issues an executive order, let's say, that clearly violates settled Supreme Court precedent, that a federal judge can't issue a nationwide injunction. For example, if a federal a president issued an order that said no one in America has right to counsel any longer, including but not limited to, in a felony case, having the government pay for your lawyer if you can't afford it. That clearly violates settled Gideon v. Wainwright. In that case, a judge has no authority or does have authority to issue a nationwide injunction. But in a case where the law is unclear, a judge should refrain from that. Now, obviously, we'd have to trust our judges, but we're supposed to be able to trust them anyway. What do you think about that?
I don't agree with that, Senator, because I think universal injunctions transgress the limitations under Article 3, even if the underlying merits are clear.
I happen to agree with you. I don't think there's any basis under Article 3, under Supreme Court precedent, under the English common law for nationwide injunctions. I think politicians have helped judges, and many judges are politicians, to just make it up. And many of them are like Professor Shaw here. If they like the president, they're against nationwide injunctions. If they don't like the president, they're for him. Professor, let me ask you this while I have you. On April 22nd, 2024, you said there are some members of the Supreme Court that are evil. Which justices were you talking about?
I'll take it your word, Senator. I don't recall using that word, but
All right, here's what you said. You were talking about the majority opinion in Muldrow v. City of St. Louis. You said, quote, Justice Kagan, will she be able to control the opinion's future distortion by her evil colleagues? Probably not, end quote. Who were you talking about?
sir, I'm very skeptical. If it's a transcription, it was probably a transcription error. I do not think I said.
No, you said it. Why don't you own up to it? Which you call some of the members of the Supreme Court evil. Now, which ones do you think are evil?
I would have to refresh my recollection. I've been very critical
You're
of some
embarrassed
members of the
that
Supreme
you made
Court.
that statement, aren't you?
I'm
You're an
telling
officer
Senator, it
of the
doesn't sound
court.
like something that
You know
I
what
would
I'm
say.
embarrassed at? That you're teaching our kids.
I don't refer to Supreme Court justices as evil in
Did
the
right here
in the classroom,
on
sir.
your podcast, April 22nd, 2024.
Okay, well,
Big as Dallas. And you're an officer of the court, and you're here advising us to be respectful to federal judges, and you say they're evil members of the United States Supreme Court? Gag me with a spoon. You're part of what's the problem in all of this.
What Senator Kennedy exposed here is the naked partisanship of these so-called legal experts. When President Biden was in office, these same professors were writing articles criticizing nationwide injunctions, calling judges who issued them political actors in robes. They understood then that it was wrong for unelected judges to substitute their judgment for that of executive branch. But now that Trump is back in the White House, suddenly these same academics think nationwide injunctions taste like pumpkin pie, as Senator Kennedy so eloquently put it. This is the problem with the left-wing legal establishment. They don't believe in consistent principles or the rule of law. They believe in results-oriented jurisprudence, which is just a fancy way of saying they want judges to rule based on their political preferences rather than the Constitution and the law. When their guy is in the White House, they want judicial restraint. When our guy is in the White House, they want judicial activism. Senator Kennedy called out this hypocrisy brilliantly when he told the professor that he had little respect for his opinion because he had read his writings. This professor literally flip-flopped on the same legal issue depending on who was president. That's not scholarship, that's political hackery masquerading as legal analysis. And these are the people teaching our future lawyers and judges in law schools across America. The discussion about federal court orders was equally revealing. When asked if they would advise a client to defy a federal court order, most witnesses said no, which is the correct answer. But one professor gave a qualified response, suggesting there might be extremely narrow circumstances where defiance could be considered. This kind of wishy-washy thinking is exactly what's wrong with legal academia today. Either we follow the rule of law, or we don't. There's no middle ground when it comes to respecting legitimate judicial authority. However, the real issue here isn't whether we should follow court orders, it's whether these nationwide injunctions are legitimate exercises of judicial power in the first place. As one witness correctly pointed out, there's no basis in Article 3 of the Constitution, Supreme Court precedent, or English common law for these sweeping nationwide injunctions. They're essentially a judicial invention that allows activist judges to impose their will on the entire country. Think about what this means for our democratic system. We elect a president to implement certain policies. The president issues executive orders to carry out the will of the voters. Then some activist judge in Hawaii or California issues a nationwide injunction stopping the president from doing what the American people elected him to do. That's not how our system is supposed to work. That's judicial tyranny, plain and simple. The forum shopping aspect that was discussed is particularly troubling. Both sides are guilty of this, as the witnesses admitted. Republicans and Democrats alike shop around for friendly judges who will rule in their favor. This turns our court system into a political battleground rather than a neutral forum for resolving legal disputes. When lawyers can predict with reasonable certainty how a judge will rule based on that judge's political leanings, we no longer have an independent judiciary. Senator Kennedy's proposal for automatic stays and expedited appeals for nationwide injunctions makes perfect sense. If these injunctions are going to exist, at least there should be a mechanism to quickly review them at a higher level. Too often, we see district judges issuing these sweeping orders that tie up presidential actions for months or years while appeals work their way through the system. That's not justice, that's obstruction. The hypothetical scenario Kennedy presented about executive orders that clearly violate Supreme Court precedent was particularly insightful. He suggested that maybe judges should only be able to issue nationwide injunctions when the law is crystal clear, like if a president tried to eliminate the right to counsel in criminal cases, which would obviously violate Gideon versus Wainwright. But in cases where the law is unclear or there's room for reasonable disagreement, judges should exercise restraint and limit their injunctions to their own jurisdictions. This makes perfect sense from a constitutional perspective. Federal judges are supposed to interpret the law, not make policy. When the law is ambiguous, that ambiguity should be resolved through the political process, not by judicial fiat. Judges who issue nationwide injunctions in legally uncertain areas are essentially acting as superlegislators, which violates the separation of powers that is fundamental to our constitutional system. But perhaps the most explosive moment in this hearing was when Senator Kennedy confronted the professor about calling Supreme Court justices evil. This perfectly encapsulates the problem with left-wing legal academia. These professors think they can make inflammatory, partisan attacks on our highest court and then come before Congress acting like neutral legal experts. The professor's attempt to deny or downplay his comments was pathetic. Kennedy had the receipts, quoting the exact statement from a specific date. This is the same mentality we see from the left when it comes to the Supreme Court generally. When the court issues decisions they like, it's a respected institution interpreting the Constitution. When it issues decisions they don't like, suddenly the justices are evil, illegitimate, or corrupt. They've called for packing the court, imposing term limits, and all sorts of other schemes to undermine its independence because they can't accept that they don't control every branch of government. The fact that this professor is teaching law students while harboring such obvious bias against conservative justices is deeply troubling. These students are being indoctrinated rather than educated. They're learning that it's acceptable to attack judges personally when you disagree with their legal reasoning. That's not how the legal profession is supposed to work. Officers of the court are supposed to respect the judicial system even when they disagree with particular decisions. Senator Kennedy was absolutely right to call out this hypocrisy and unprofessional behavior. The professor's embarrassment was obvious, and it should be. He got caught red-handed being a partisan hack while pretending to be an objective legal scholar. This is exactly the kind of accountability we need more of in Washington. What this hearing really reveals is the broader crisis in our judicial system. We have too many activist judges who think their job is to implement their political preferences rather than interpret the law. We have legal academics who abandon their principles based on partisan considerations. And we have a system that allows single judges to override the will of the American people through nationwide injunctions that have no basis in constitutional text or historical practice. The solution isn't complicated, but it requires political will. Congress needs to pass legislation limiting the scope of injunctions that district judges can issue. The Supreme Court needs to clarify the constitutional limits on judicial power. And the American people need to demand better from their legal institutions. We also need to be more careful about who we confirm to the federal bench. Too many of these activist judges are products of the same left-wing law schools that are churning out politically biased legal scholars. We need judges who understand that their job is to interpret the law as written, not to advance a political agenda. President Trump has been excellent at appointing constitutional originalists to the federal courts, but there's still a lot of work to be done. The Biden administration spent 4 years packing the courts with liberal activists, and it will take time to restore balance to our judicial system. This hearing also highlights why elections matter so much. The policies that voters choose at the ballot box shouldn't be subject to veto by unelected judges who disagree with the political outcomes. When we elect a president, we're not just choosing an individual, we're choosing a direction for the country. Activist judges who use nationwide injunctions to block presidential actions are essentially disenfranchising millions of voters. The arrogance of these legal academics is really something to behold. They think they know better than the American people what's good for the country. They think they can manipulate the legal system to achieve political outcomes that they couldn't win at the ballot box. And they think they can hide their bias behind a veneer of scholarly respectability. Senator Kennedy saw right through this facade and exposed it for what it really is. His questioning was sharp, well-informed, and devastating. He came prepared with specific examples and quotes that the witnesses couldn't deny or explain away. This is the kind of oversight we need from Congress. Patriots, what we saw in this hearing is a microcosm of the larger battle we're fighting for the soul of our country. On one side, we have constitutional conservatives who believe in the rule of law, separation of powers, and democratic accountability. On the other side, we have progressive activists who believe the ends justify the means, and that they have the right to impose their will through whatever institutions they can capture. The fight over nationwide injunctions might seem like an arcane legal issue, but it's really about something much more fundamental. It's about whether we're going to remain a constitutional republic governed by the rule of law, or whether we're going to become an oligarchy governed by unelected judges and bureaucrats. This is why your support matters so much. Channels like America First are fighting to expose this corruption and hold these institutions accountable. The mainstream media won't tell you about the partisan bias in our law schools or the constitutional problems with nationwide injunctions. They're too busy pushing their own political agenda. But we're here to give you the truth, even when it's uncomfortable. We're here to ask the tough questions and demand answers. And we're here to stand up for the principles that made America great in the first place. So again, if you found this analysis valuable, smash that like button and subscribe to join our growing Patriot family. Share this video with your friends and family who need to understand what's really going on in our judicial system. And if you can, support us on Patreon at patreon.com/America First for as low as $5 a month. Together, we can hold our institutions accountable and restore constitutional government to this great nation. Thanks for watching America First, and we'll see you in the next video where we continue fighting for the principles that made America the greatest country in the history of the world.